So today I want to summarize a book for you, and it's not just any book. It is the book that I give so much credit to for all the changes that have been going on in my life in the past year or so, ever since I read it. It is The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. I recommend this book to just about everyone I meet. If it somehow comes up in conversation, I am like, wow, you have to read this book. But I understand that in today's world especially, it can be really hard to find that kind of time to read an entire book. So instead I've decided to make a video. That way, instead of recommending a book that'll maybe take 12 hours to read, it's just a video that will hopefully take maybe 12 minutes. We'll see about how long it is after this. But anyway, let's get into it. Alright, so chapter 1, the title pretty much sums it up. You are not your mind. What does it mean by this? It means we tend to have many thoughts go through our head throughout the day, and many emotions stir up, things like that. And we tend to think that these thoughts are who we are. So let's say you have a bad thought, it goes through your head and you think, wow, like I'm a bad person, or wow, I am a sad person, or something like that. But really, those thoughts just come through your head, and often they're shaped by our environment. So really, the thoughts, it's not you coming up with the thoughts per se, it's really just based on what's happening in your life, certain thoughts will arise in your head. And so, recognizing that you are not the little voice in your head, but instead you are actually the observer who is watching these thoughts go through your head. That is the revelation that is key to chapter 1 of this book. By disidentifying with your thoughts and your emotions, you can learn to better control them. And that's actually the key to meditation. That's why meditation is becoming so popular these days, because it's a way of trying to observe your thoughts rather than judging them or identifying with them. And this can lead to being much happier. This state he's referring to when you are present, or when you are not thinking about things like the past or the future or hypothetical situations. It's what he calls presence or consciousness. So if you hear me refer to those words, that's what I'm talking about. The state of not thinking and instead just observing thoughts going through your head. Chapter 2 is called Consciousness, the Way Out of Pain. And there's a quote from this chapter which I think sums it up pretty well. An increasingly heavy burden of time has been accumulating in the human mind. All individuals are suffering under this burden, but they also keep adding to it every moment when they ignore or deny that precious moment or reduce it to a means of getting to some future moment which only exists in the mind, never in actuality. Basically what he's talking about here is that a lot of our pain in our lives is actually self-caused. It's basically us thinking too much about the past or the future and causing ourselves pain because we're just imagining things that may or may not happen in the future, or dwelling on things that have already happened in the past that we can't even control anymore. Whereas if we were just to focus on the present moment, we wouldn't have any of these issues. I mean, apart from the fact that, I guess, if you are currently in this moment in a really bad situation, like a life-threatening situation, yeah, of course, that's not gonna be relevant. But 99% of the time when we're going about our days, there's nothing wrong with the present moment. We're at work or we're doing whatever. And you may have small problems there, but it's not stuff that should be causing the sort of pain that we cause ourselves. Like, we overthink things and just make it way, way too hard. Another extremely important topic that he touches on in this chapter, which I think about all the time, is not identifying with a mental position in an argument. Basically what he's saying here is that if you believe something to be true and you identify with that thought, then when someone else either disagrees with it or proves it wrong, it not only just proves that thought wrong, but it proves you wrong as a person because you have tied your identity to that mental position. So by not identifying with mental positions in your head, it's much easier to just admit that you're wrong, and that's that. And a lot of times this is why there are so many conflicts. For example, like in family life, like when parents and their kids are always fighting, a lot of the time it's because one or both parties don't want to admit they're wrong. It may actually turn out that halfway through the argument, one of them might realize they're wrong, but then they still just keep arguing because for them to be wrong would be for them to completely just be destroyed because they've identified with that mental position and now they have to defend it with their life. And that can be dangerous, and that's why many conflicts don't stop, because people just have to keep it alive. So moving on to chapter 3, moving deeply into the now. The beginning of this chapter, he actually kind of gives a recap of what we've talked about before. He says, "You have already understood the basic mechanics of the unconscious state. Identification with the mind, which creates a false self called the ego, as a substitute for your true self rooted in being," which is more the observer, the one that's watching the thoughts. One important topic that he touches on in this chapter is that if you identify with your problems, as many people do, the last thing you want is to become free of them, because that would mean a loss of self. What he means by this is that people often identify with some of the negative aspects of their life to the point where subconsciously it makes you actually not want to change that thing in your life because it's a part of who you are. And so to lose that problem would be to lose a piece of who you are, which when you think about it consciously like this, it doesn't make any sense. If it's a problem, you want it to go away, right? But subconsciously, on the ego level, unconsciously, I guess he would put it, you don't want that problem to go away because that problem is part of who you are. But simply just being aware of this fact can help you not let that happen in your own life. Another good quote here is, "Identification with the mind gives it more energy. Observation of the mind withdraws energy from it." And then he goes on to explain the difference between clock time, which is practical, versus psychological time, which is just identification with the past and continuous compulsive projection into the future. In other words, you can use time as we know it in a practical way, or you can be caught up in it by thinking way too much about the past, way too much about the future, as opposed to being present in the moment, which he refers to as being timeless. And now this right here is extremely key. Unease, anxiety, tension, stress, and worry all come from thinking too much about the future. Whereas guilt, regret, resentment, grievances, sadness, bitterness, and non-forgiveness come from thinking too much about the past. So if you think about all those words I just threw out, those are almost all of our problems. When we think about why we're not happy, why we're having a problem right now, it usually falls into one of those two bigger categories or one of those more specific emotions like anxiety or guilt. Something else that's very important from this chapter is a quote I have here. "You no longer depend on the future for fulfillment and satisfaction. You don't look to it for salvation. Therefore, you are not attached to the results. Neither failure nor success has the power to change your inner state of being. You have found the life underneath your life situation." So there's a few important things here. One is what I just ended with. He distinguishes between your life and your life situation. Your life is the actual being inside you, that observer that I was talking about before, our consciousness, all that. And your life situation, of course, is just the things that are happening in your life. Like I'm living in this house, I make YouTube videos, I have a girlfriend, etc., etc. That's my life situation. And the most important thing about this quote is that he is pointing out the fact that so many people look to the future to find fulfillment. In other words, you say, "I will be happy when I move into my own place," or "I will be happy when I get promoted at work. I'll be happy when blah, blah, blah." Watch out for that. Try not to ever be saying, "I'll be happy when," because all you're doing when you do that is you're implying that you're not happy now, that the now is not good enough. And that is very dangerous, because by doing that, not only will you not be happy from now until then, but even once then comes around, that pleasure only lasts a little bit. Once you get that promotion or you move out, you'll be really happy about that for a few days, a few weeks, something like that. But there will always be that next thing that you're going to be waiting for, that you want, that you need for your happiness. So it's not so much that specific thing, it's the whole mentality. The mentality of thinking that I'll be happy when. That will keep you from being happy ever, because you'll literally just get happiness for a couple days once you reach that thing, and then you'll just have to reach the next thing and the next thing, and it's this constant struggle of not being happy and then having to work so hard to get something that only makes you happy for a couple hours, a couple days, even a couple weeks at most, as opposed to being happy with what you have now and just being grateful for what you have and being happy with what you have. And by doing this, it also wipes away fear. What he says in the book, when your deeper sense of self is derived from being, when you are free of becoming as a psychological need, neither your happiness nor your sense of self depends on the outcome, and so there is freedom from fear. So in other words, if I don't have to worry about not becoming super famous or whatever, then I don't have to worry about it. Like, if I was so concerned and so caught up with having to become famous in a couple of years, I would be scared all the time at some level that it's not going to happen. But because my happiness, I base, or at least I try to base it on what I have and being in the present moment, it doesn't matter what happens a year or two down the road in terms of my YouTube life. Whether I have 1 million subscribers or 0, it doesn't matter. I'm still going to be happy. And so that's the main point of this chapter. Chapter 4 is called Mind Strategies for Avoiding the Now. So basically what he's talking about here is that the mind will try to trick you into not being present. And it's important to be aware of how it will try to do this so that you can always stay present and not fall into the trap of excessive thinking. So here he starts to further distinguish unconsciousness into ordinary unconsciousness, which he says is like the sound of an air conditioner. You never really notice it until it stops, versus deep unconsciousness, which is more acute pain, like when something big goes wrong. And one big example of ordinary unconsciousness is complaining. This is a huge topic. A big quote from this section is, "If you find your here and now intolerable and it makes you unhappy, you have 3 options. Remove yourself from the situation, change it, or accept it totally." And this is huge. This is something I think about every single day. I try not to complain about anything in my life because if I don't like it, I know that I either have the power to change it, or if I don't, then I just need to accept it and find a way around it. And that's that. As he says, all else is madness. The rest is just unnecessary suffering that we cause ourselves. Basically, by trying to eliminate ordinary unconsciousness, we are trying to eliminate the background static of perpetual discontent, which I found to be the perfect way to describe how I felt most of the time between, who knows, like between puberty and like a year ago. Like, there would just be this constant slight unease or unhappiness, just like things weren't quite right and I didn't know why. If that feeling sounds familiar to you, that might be overthinking. That might be unconsciousness, ordinary unconsciousness, as Eckhart Tolle puts it. And the best way out of it, things like meditation, just being aware of the present moment and not letting your mind take you over. Chapter 5 is called The State of Presence, and here, of course, he just dives a little bit deeper into what presence is, although he starts out the chapter by explaining how you can't mentally understand presence. You can only experience it. So in the same way that you can't understand it, I can't really explain to you what it is. You have to kind of experience it for yourself. And so it's really just the time between thoughts. And that's the whole purpose of meditating, is to try not to let thoughts go through your head. And if they do, you simply observe them, drop them, let them go. And that way you can have better control over your mind and your thoughts. He then goes on to explain, the collective egoic mind is the most dangerously insane and destructive entity ever to inhabit this planet. And really what he's talking about here is how, not just on a personal level of me, for example, not being present all the time, but everyone being somewhat unconscious all the time is really the #1 threat to the earth. I mean, that's the reason why we have such massive global problems like wars, like climate change. It's due to nearly the entire human population being unconscious to some extent, because if everyone were completely conscious, completely tied in with being and present to the moment, these sort of things would probably not happen, according to Eckhart Tolle. He also explains how drugs and alcohol revert you to a level of consciousness below thought, and that's much of the reason why people get hooked on them, because it's just, you're always torturing yourself constantly with your own thoughts, and you don't even realize it, and the only way you know how to fix it is by drinking too much or taking too many drugs. But obviously the better solution would be to learn how to better control your mind through things such as meditation. A good way to think about meditation is here he says, Listening to the silence underneath and in between the sounds immediately creates stillness inside you. So for example, one thing that's talked about when it comes to meditation is that you should listen to what's going on around you, hear the sounds in your environment. But not only should you be listening to the sounds, but also the silence between the sounds, the silence that allows the sounds to even exist. Does that sound kind of familiar? It's like with the thoughts going through your head, you have to be somewhere in there watching the thoughts. Like you are the blank space through which the thoughts can come. Much in the same way, the silence is there so that the sounds can come into it. It's a very similar thing. And then he ends the chapter referring a little bit to Christianity, saying, the second coming of Christ is a transformation of human consciousness, a shift from time to presence, from thinking to pure consciousness, not the arrival of some man or some woman. Basically what he's saying here is that he believes that Christianity has been kind of misunderstood over the years, that many Christians now think that Christ is literally going to come back again, like Jesus will reincarnate and come here and save us all. But what they're really referring to is that Christ or God is actually really more just the feeling of presence. Like presence essentially is God, according to Eckhart Tolle. And so the second coming is actually just, as he says here, a shift in the human consciousness. And the last thing to note here is that he refers a lot to the ego, which is very closely tied with the idea of identification with form. In other words, identification with your body, so your physical form, or with your job, or with your life situation, or your mental stance on a subject, like I said earlier, or even with a thought. Like a thought technically doesn't sound like a form, but he puts it into the category of form. Basically anything apart from the formless, which is the idea of presence and being. So that wraps up the first half of The Power of Now. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I have explained this stuff well enough. As I said, it can be really hard to explain because it's really kind of deep spiritual stuff that in some ways you have to really experience it and see it in your own life more than just hear someone say it or read it. But if you want more information on it, obviously read the book. I still highly recommend it. Even if you've watched this video or anything, it helps so much to read about it more in depth and then see how it can kind of apply in your own life. For example, I read it over the course of maybe 8 months or so, just reading a little bit here and there. And I really think that's the best way to read it because that way you can kind of learn about it, see how it applies in your own life, come back to it, and just keep going like that, because then it starts to really make sense. That's how you really fully understand it, in my opinion. And if you have read the book, please let me know how I did with this summary. I'd really like to know any extra thoughts you have, because these are just the notes that I had taken the first time reading it. And so maybe I left some things out, but I think I got the gist of it. And I hope you tune in next time for the second half, because still more cool stuff to come. That's it for today. Peace.